Hello and welcome. This is the first of our Artists and Artists for this season, and it's just an incredible honor to be starting the season with two amazing artists. Andrea Bowers and Martha Rosler are going to be in conversation tonight, and it's really also a marked occasion as well. I think this is one of our first. We've had a few, but this is really the first that's been a concerted conversation between two artists. And it's a pleasure to mark the occasion with them together. I'm Kelly Kivlin. I'm an associate curator here at DIA. And for those that don't know, I just wanted to share a little bit of history on the Artists and Artists Lecture Series. It was initiated in 2001, so we're headed into our end of our 15th year. And it's continued ever since to be very much a beloved series here in the city as a place where we invite artists to respond and or challenge or to be a generative experience for them to consider a work by an artist either in DIA's collection or in our exhibition or program history. So for instance, tonight, Andrea chose, and it's always that the artist choosing who they would like to speak on. Andrea chose to speak on Martha's work, primarily because we commissioned Martha to realize a project in 1989, and it was called If You Lived Here. And it was at our space, actually two spaces in Soho. One was at 77 Wooster, and the other one was at 155 Mercer. Before I begin a little bit more about that project, I just want to thank a few people, the Department of Cultural Affairs for their generous support of the series, as well as to Brooklyn Brewery, and to my colleagues, to Francesca Logalbo and to Max Finone, who, without them and their assistance, this program wouldn't be possible. As I mentioned, it's the first Artists and Artists on Martha, and by way of an introduction of the two artists, who I'm sure you know well, I thought it would be best to very much give context to this project that was realized in 1989, for those that don't know much. And I will do that first by reading a short excerpt from a publication that was put together from the exhibition itself, or the installation, the project. And then I'll also read from an artist statement of a press release that you'll actually have on your chair and you have in hand maybe now. And I'll actually guide you through that so you can maybe read together if you can in the dark. So in 1987, DIA invited 5 arts professionals to meet with our staff in New York to discuss DIA's exhibition program for the coming years. This group represented a diversity of informed opinions and positions and included Harold Zaman, Casper Koenig, Kathy Halbrecht, and I'm skipping around here, Richard Bellamy and Yvonne Rayner. Out of these discussions, particularly through the urging of Yvonne Rayner, emerged the need to support the work of artists engaged in exploring a broader range of art making than that generally had been presented in museums or galleries. The DIA staff, at her recommendation, approached socially engaged artists, group material, and Martha Rosler to consider projects at DIA. And it quickly became clear that these projects could not be conventional exhibitions. Rather than developing projects at 548 West 22nd Street, which is, of course, the former DIA Center for the Arts building across the street, the decision was made with the artists to use the spaces in Soho, those I mentioned earlier. And these were spaces of installations and town meetings, and they were all part of a one-year project that was undertaken by these two artists, or group material and Martha. So for If I Lived Here, I'd like to just read from the press release that was produced to give context to the 3 installations that she undertook that spring. If You Lived Here is a project organized by Martha Rosler for the DIA Art Foundation, focusing on housing, homelessness, real estate, and related issues. 3 installations at 77 Wooster Street and 4 public discussions at 155 Mercer Street will be sponsored beginning on February 11th, and they continue through June 17 of 1989. And you can read more, of course, in the packet that you received. But I'll skip ahead, and I'll just conclude by reading the artist statement that Martha put together to give context to this incredibly comprehensive project that was actually 2 years in the making. The past decade or so has been a wholesome return of middle-class professionals to metropolitan centers in a process dubbed gentrification. The pincers of gentrification and abandonment have combined to displace the poor, mostly non-white residents to whom the inner city was left as a result of the white flight and suburbanization of the 1960s. Urban cycles of decline, decay, and abandonment, followed by a renaissance of rehabilitation, renovation, and reconstruction, may appear to be natural processes. In fact, however, the, quote, fall and rise of cities, end quote, are consequent not only on financial and productive cycles and the fiscal crisis of the state, but also on social policy. In New York, the price exacted for relative fiscal stability has been a wholesome turnover of the city to banks and developers. One glaringly apparent consequence has been the spectacular decline of sizable areas, such as the South Bronx, Harlem, Lower Manhattan, and areas of Brooklyn and Queens, preparatory to the deliverance into the hands of developers of upper-income housing, primarily in the form of condominiums, not rental units. Thus, while the, quote, outer boroughs, end quote, suffer planned shrinkage, the withdrawal of essential services from fire protection to bank mortgages, Manhattanizes, developing highly concentrated central zones of grandiose office towers and palatial hotels and residences. In New York, the privatization and decontrol of housing stock has slashed the proportion of renters and driven the number of homeless skyward. Artists are often seen as a small but pivotal group in erasing the return of the middle class to cities. Ironically, however, artists are often themselves displaced by the same wealthy professionals or clientele who follow them into the suddenly chic urban areas. If New York Soho was the earliest, most visible of the recent cases, its Lower East Side reveals how the process has been routinized and sped up. What about New York as an art center? The same forces driving the real estate market, the search for the investments that provide both safety and windfall profits, the urge to recreate the world according to the values of the money-mad business community, have affected art and artists' lives and goals. Has New York slipped as a place to make art as Manhattan rents have soared beyond the reach of unmoneyed young artists, and as an artist-run centers have aged and declined? What about the new community-based galleries in the outer boroughs, New Jersey, and still marginal areas of Manhattan? These exhibitions and discussions are intended to suggest the interrelations between the city's political, financial, real estate, and art systems, but they also address issues of housing and homelessness directly. These are directed at representing, questioning, perhaps intervening in the situation of artists in their relation to society, including the local and national conditions in which they live, produce, and exhibit work. Please join me in welcoming Martha Rosler and Andrea Bowers.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to explain sort of a little bit about my position in this really quickly, and then Martha has put this amazing PowerPoint together. How many images is it now? Like,
I played the fifth.
Okay. It's amazing. It's an amazing archive, and maybe if she's willing, she'll talk about the project, because it's so complex and interesting and layered. Maybe she'll talk about it for like 5 minutes just to describe it a little bit. Okay, you have to excuse, I can't see anything, so I have to wear bad glasses. Okay, so on a personal level, storytelling and oral histories have always been the best method for me to learn. I have also come to believe that storytelling is an important women's tradition for history recording, as well as a form of feminist agitation. Video interviews documenting the lives and actions of activists have become a repeated medium in my practice. When asked to select an artist from the Dia collection and the various Dia projects, I was immediately drawn to 2 separate series that took place from September '88 to June '89. I mean, it wasn't even a question. I think when I talked to Kelly in like 2 seconds, I was like, well, there's 2 projects I'm going to talk about. And then immediately I was like, I want to, address If You Lived Here by Martha, that proposed social and political inquiries as a new model for the Dia programming, which is actually something Charlie Wright said. I decided to focus on Martha's project, If You Lived Here. It educates activates, and organizes. Everything I hope my work can do. I wanted to immerse myself in this project and learn from the inventive curatorial practices, community engagement, archival strategies, and theoretical discourse. I consider If You Lived Here to be an epic work, a masterwork, and I mean that in all the most subversive ways possible. That since its inception in '89, it has continued to develop for 25 years, and I wanted to learn from Martha. Although this series of Dia Talks Artist on Artist is predicated on one artist responding to another artist's work, I felt that my subjective response on its own would be inappropriate, if not unethical, due to the political content that is at stake at the heart of this project. Therefore, I asked Martha if she would have a public conversation with me about this project. I was so grateful. I just want to thank Jessica Morgan, Kelly Kivlin, and especially Martha Rosler for their support and collaboration in this. And one more thing, I want to quote Yvonne Rainer in a text that's in the amazing catalog, book, sorry, not a catalog, book. And I think it's as relevant today as it was then in '91. And she said, "One can only hope that the closing of the Wooster Street space that housed democracy and If You Lived Here does not signal the end of Dia's involvement with artist/activist curated exhibitions, and that these particular projects have constituted a genuine precedent for future exhibitions sponsored by that commendable organization." Okay, so enough with that. So Martha, if you can, if you want to just go into more detail than say Kelly went into, to just give an overview of the project. Yeah, okay.
Hello, thanks for coming. I can't actually see you, but I see reflections on glasses and so on. Thanks for inviting me and so generously sharing your time and your relationship to the work. It's a work, as we've heard, from 1989, and it came about because Yvonne Rainer was a bit distressed by the fact that Dia had, at the time, many high modernist, particularly male, artists exhibiting in their various spaces and were supporting a roster of artists with monthly stipends and so on, but at the same time they had these wonderfully lively discursive events where they had talks and people came in and discussed various vital issues to the art community and the world in general, I suppose. And there was a book, and I actually participated in one or two of them. It was a book series, and that's why I refer to this as a book, called Discussions in Contemporary Culture. And Yvonne essentially said, you have this wonderfully engaged series, but nothing you do in your exhibition program reflects that. So how about you step up and choose a few of those artists? And she named, like, Group Material and Martha Rosler. So they went to Group Material and Martha Rosler. It was simple. So thanks to Yvonne for thinking of us. And Group Material put together their project. They were first. I'll say a little bit more about that. And I was asked to make a presentation. I showed them a work that I had done called Fascination with the Game of the Exploding Historical Hollow Leg, which was an anti-nuclear, one-person singing, dancing exhibition, giant thing that I'd done in Boulder, Colorado, which was in '82, which was an anti-nuclear show because Reagan was threatening to blow up the world and was placing cruise missiles. All of Western Europe was also quite exercised about the cruise missiles and so on. And I made altered maps, and I had performance materials. I made video. I invited students and speakers to talk on Central America, our covert wars, and so on. And so I said I would like to do a project on homelessness because at that time, New York, which really didn't have a problem of large numbers of homeless people visibly everywhere, was actually, it was a major issue. Everyone could see that there were all these evicted people living wherever they could, in cardboard boxes and in parks and so on. And there was a hue and cry about it, and a kind of really grotesque othering and disregard and, shock, horror, and so on. And it was clear to me that this was not just happening in New York, because I was doing a lot of traveling. So I had proposed doing work about homelessness. That was fine with Dia. And then I had a realization. In the many cities that I'd gone to, there were artists in local communities who were doing work precisely about this. Nobody talked about it in the New York art world, and I thought, I don't have to be the genius here. I can actually, following the model of group material, just get together work that I'd seen elsewhere and just organize a show. I don't have to make the show, because the issue's not me, it's artists responding to this issue. But I was teaching in the Whitney program, and I was doing sort of studio visits, and I walked into the studio of a student named Dan Wiley, and there were all these maps of New York and all these issues about housing and so on, and I said, Dan, you want to work with me? So Dan Wiley became my absolutely invaluable assistant. He was not only an art student, he was a graduate student up at Columbia studying urban planning, and he had all kinds of familial ties to the activist community, particularly in Harlem. And we just started talking about who we could invite to be in the show, and we decided very early on that this was not about art so much as the issues. And we started calling advocacy groups and housing defenders, and like the Met Council on Housing or Harlem Fight Back, and groups in Brooklyn and the South Bronx, and said, would you like to be in the exhibition? And if you don't know what to put in the exhibition, we can help you develop something to put on the walls, or however you'd like to have a presence. And the other thing is that I'd gotten in the habit of having libraries at the shows that I was doing. I had cooking performance, and I had 100 cookbooks, and for the anti-nuclear show, there was also a lot of books on display. And I wanted to build a reading room this time, not just have a library, but have a library room. And the other thing is that at some point, I had to confront the fact that a show on homelessness was a middle-class look at a group of people who were not us, and that was completely unacceptable to me. And that homelessness is not a thing, it's an outcome. So the show actually had to be about the process by which people become evicted, and then at the other end, so as not to just say, yeah, and then there's that, there had to be questions about remediation, change, other ways of thinking about society, and as we now say, the rights of the city. So I talked to my curator, Gary Garles, and I said, look, it can't just be one thing. And he said, oh, we can have a changing exhibition. And then I thought, no, we can't, because people will visit once and they won't come back. So we have to have 3 shows. So the first show was called Homefront, and it was about contested communities. The second was called Homeless, the Street and Other Venues, because people who are living doubled up or couch surfing, whatever, are also homeless. And the third was City Visions and Revisions, and it was about architecture, urban planning, and real and fanciful solutions to the question of making the city. And there were, the concept of town hall came from Dia, which was a wonderful idea. Town hall, how pretentious, but actually it worked out rather well. But I said, but we need to have not just one for each show, there has to be a fourth one on art and artists, artist housing. Do artists deserve subsidized housing? And I have to say that of all the town halls, that was the one where people practically came to blows, artists fighting over whether artists should have subsidized housing, because of course there was only a small amount of subsidy available. And of course there were, well, a city full of underhoused and poor people and homeless people, and why should artists get it? But that's not the way the panel discussion was organized. And in fact, they weren't panel discussions, brief conversations, presentations by people, including an artist in every panel, and then open to participation. So I have, aside from a voice problem, I have a bunch of images which we will just go through, but I'd like to start and say something about this one. One of the things that really moved me was the idea that in typical middle-class fashion, students there was an architectural competition to make shitty shelters for homeless people, for which students would be richly rewarded. This is not going to go back, it's okay. And I must say that still continues, and it still drives me crazy when people are rewarded for designing tents and shelters and jackets that you can fold around yourself and turn into, like, excuse me, the problem is housing. Could we stick to the point? It's not a tent, it's not a folding chair, it's not a guided missile, it's housing. So these are set to go really fast. I didn't do the time. And the title of the show came from a real estate sign I used to see as I was driving with my parents through Flushing. It was Lefrak City, I guess. It said, if you lived here, you'd be home now. Of course, my thought at the time was, yeah, but who would want to be home there? But it stuck with me. Okay, over to you.
Okay. Well, maybe we could start off talking a little bit more about, like, institutionally, how you dealt with the fact that you were being offered a solo show and you ended up saying, well, I'm actually going to be a curator and do a group exhibition. And how is that, how the DIA handled that?
They already had group material, and I do have to say that not only was I friendly with them, Doug Ashford, who was part of group material, happened to have been my student at Cooper, so we were quite close, and he gave me a lot of pointers on how DIA was going to treat me, which was very useful. So I don't think that was the problem, you know. DIA was in for a penny, in for a pound, whatever, but I did remark that nobody from DIA, you know, we were over at 77 Worcester, they were at 155. They didn't come over to see the hanging or anything until the opening. They had an assistant, Karen Romspacher, who was our liaison between the people with the money and us in the show, and that worked out quite well. But no sleeping in the gallery.
You were sleeping?
No sleeping in the, that became an issue.
We can
deal
talk
that.
about that a little bit, or you want to wait?
Yeah, let's wait.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, and of course, the DIA building, being a high modernist gray box, was totally invisible, so we put up a sign on it. I used to walk past it and say, so where's our building? Mm-hmm. So we put it, come on in, we're home, or something.
With the red lettering.
Yeah.
Can we maybe go back to the Bowery project photo
yeah.
series and maybe the relationship between those two projects? Can you talk about that a little bit? Or
Well, you have to explain to people what the Bowery project is. I didn't think to put a picture in there.
she's going to make me talk about her work now. The Bowery project is a series of photographs that are both image and text-based, pieces, and it's in addition, how many are in, how many?
It's 48 black and white photos and photos of text.
Photos of text.
Yeah, I think
And the photos were taken on the Bowery? Were you living there or near there?
At that moment, I was.
At that moment. What year was
living
that?
on St. Mark's Place.
St. Mark's
At
Place.
the end of the fall of '74. So they're taken in 2 visits walking down the Bowery in December of '74 and printed in '75 when I was back home in San Diego.
And they represent homelessness
No,
in a
not
certain
at
way,
all.
or?
Not at all.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No, I mean, that's a natural back reading, and it's good that you brought that up. What it represents are people who are transient, mostly drunk, and whose geopolitical entitlement to the city consists of the imaginary space between the storefront and the street. The Bowery was a long-standing skid row, which is a term actually from Seattle, but where transients lived and went to get work in the Depression. And there were what are called SROs, or single-room occupancy hotels, lining the entire Bowery. And so they were not allowed to stay there during the day, so they stayed on the street or in the bars, and then they went and lived in the hotels. But it's about disentitlement and the relationship that a museum-going, documentary-loving culture has to representations of Bowery bums. It was pretty specific. It was about the relationship of the image of the transient, vagrant drunk, and the way that it was valorized by being put on the wall in a gallery. A lot of my work at the time was designed to be extra institutional, to circulate through the mail or on video or whatever it was, but not in the institution. This was work made for museum and gallery display to hang on the wall alongside other documentary photographs, in a sense as a silent witness to a different way of thinking. So there were images of storefronts without the subject, because photography is metonymy, and the subject was absent. There are empty bottles, which in a way become symbolic persons. And then there are the texts, which are drawn from a social lexicon of drunkenness. And
It very much, in my thinking, critiques a tradition of representation, of objectifying, of objectification, and your photos are a kind of critique of that, or present an alternative to that. And then I believe that also then, as a subject of representation, you also were dealing with it in this exhibition, or it became a driving force in this exhibition.
I don't think there's anything I do that isn't also about representation and value. So I'm completely engaged with the content of my work, but I'm always looking at it from the point of view of its function as a representation, and that's whether it's anti-war or women, cooking, housing, or whatever it is always the question of what is a representation that is the stock we draw upon here. So the question immediately arose of what is the role of homeless people in this show, but Dan was in contact with Bill Batson, who was working with the city, and he put us in contact with a group calling itself Homeward Bound Community Services, who, in a very high-profile manner, was sleeping for 100 plus days in front of City Hall. In City Hall Park, there was a lot of attention to this. They were supported by a church where they slept at night. But the idea was they constituted a group who saw themselves as a voice for themselves and for homeless people in general. So we started, Dan and I, meeting with them in the summer and saying, are you interested in participating in this project? And they said, sure. So we talked for a few months and said, so what would you like to do? And they said, we would like to have an office in the show, in the gallery. And
how did they see the office in the gallery serving them?
They wanted to hold workshops. They wanted to be able to make phone calls. They had all kinds of plans that they gave out for, first of all, for offering services, but also for serving other homeless people. They saw themselves both as serving themselves, but also as offering a wider service to homeless people. And Larry Locke, who participated in one of our town hall meetings, was often interviewed and also was on the radio and so on, and Duke York talking about this. And there's a book that's a little odd that came out afterward. I forget who wrote, a guy named Giler, that was called Sleeping with the Mayor, which was a post facto fictionalized account exactly of this group. And some of it's true and some of it, from what I know, clearly isn't. But so the idea was that we had no intention of speaking for homeless people. There were advocacy groups and actually shelter organizers who worked with us, but the point was that this group could speak for themselves, and did.
So that completely gets around some of those critiques about, speaking for others. And
Well, actually, for the essay that I wrote under duress about the Bowery piece, I wrote an essay. The photo piece was done in 75. In 81, published an essay called In, Around, and Afterthoughts on documentary photography, exactly about not speaking for others. And that was what the critique of documentary I was making was, and also saying the words about drunkenness are our words. They're something we hold in common, and yet we are othering, though that wasn't actually a term one used so freely at the time. But so this was an issue very much for me and for the group I worked with. We're just coming from San Diego, where the group, which was based at the University of California, San Diego, there's a show on the extensions of photography, and this constituted our intentions toward photography, which was to rethink how, to put it as crudely as possible, how photography can tell the truth and how it can function both within the art world and also outside it.
So, I've been teaching for, I guess, 9 or 10 years in Otis's public practice program that's founded by Suzanne Lacey. And it's, we're teaching community organizing strategies. We're teaching, the kind of foundation of collaborative practices in socially engaged work. Now, when I look at this piece, it fulfills like all the categories of socially engaged work. Was that language anybody was using at the time? Did you realize, we talk about curation as a method, we talk about, how to reach out through, sort of like sociological case study research, how to do the research to work within communities to have that be your driving force, how to question your own preferences and privileges, and you were doing all of this. So how did you talk or think about this at the time? How did you decide to move into this direction as an artist?
Common sense.
Oh, come on, Martha. It's like, were there any models out there that you were looking at?
only group material, and of course what they did was really different. They were interested in not only, first of all, you have to understand that even the idea of a thematic exhibition was anathema to the art world at the time. It was just beginning, and group material was actually at the forefront of having subject-related, that is content-related shows. So obviously I was interested in that, and I participated in a couple of their shows. But they were very interested in the idea of high art and low art, and I was interested in not art, which, as we know from Alan Capro, is kind of a vexed concept, but still. I was interested in working with people who ordinarily would not be together with art world artists or community artists in the same discursive and exhibition space. It just seemed like the obvious thing. So this is Homeward Bound.
So what were, I mean, working with activists, working with so many, you know, well, you had a lot of artists, you were curating a show, but you were also working with, like,
Organizing a show.
organizing a show. Curating is the wrong word. Organizing, okay.
Curators are trained. It's a job, you know.
Okay. Organizing a show. This is Homeward Bound.
And some friends.
And some,
There
yeah.
were no children in Homeward Bound. There were no, yeah.
Can we talk about the beds yet?
That's about to show up in a minute.
Okay. I'm wondering what were some of the most, like, difficult ethical decisions, or what were some of the...
Oh, and I should talk about this group. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Okay, no problem.
So this, I heard about this from a guy whose name I'm just forgetting. I'm sorry. I think he was at Pratt. He said you ought to get in touch with the Madhousers. I didn't know anything about Mockbee Studio at the time, but subsequently I've come to realize these were probably graduates who worked at the Mockbee Studio, Samuel Mockbee. They were graduate students and recent graduates, I guess they were mostly recent graduates from Auburn. And they built huts for homeless people on waste space. The homeless people they worked with were clients, and they saw this as not only providing temporary housing, but also as creating a kind of a billboard for saying, look, we have all these homeless people, but also, so this is Homeward Bound clowning in the hut. They're pretending like, yeah, we'd want to live here. I mean, not in New York. So we did put one on 8th Street right after Koch tore down a tenement.
Put that there.
Oh, yeah. That's not a collage. No, it's real. And this is, you'll laugh, this is Dumbo. I lived, Vito lived there, and I lived at the end of the block, yeah, yes, on Pearl Street. Think about that, and what it looks like now. So they saw this as a way of guiding their clients into services so that they could move out of homelessness. They didn't see these huts as being solutions. This is by Kristen Reed. I think I'm rambling. So what? Oh, because I interrupted. You asked me a question. So I invited them. I want to finish the Dia anecdote. You want to come up and build in New York? No, we don't. Oh, really? Why not? We're not New Yorkers. We don't know anybody. We don't just drop in. And Dan said, no problem. We'll introduce you to all these social service agencies and fight back groups and so on. And they stayed in the dirt room, the earth room, for a week. And yeah, that's...
Not in the apartment, in the room next to it?
Yeah.
In the dirt room?
No, of course
in the
not.
apartment?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
That's where you are, right?
Where I am. Yeah.
Right.
So,
So then they came and they built 3 huts.
I was wondering about, like, some of the, I would assume dealing with this, there's some, like, ethical dilemmas that you ran into, or...
Like what?
I don't know, I just feel like ethical decisions are some of the hardest thing I have to make. Like, I'm always struggling ethically.
These are homeless artists.
And I don't mean that in a negative way. I think it's the most challenging part of my practice is like, I think sometimes there are ethical dilemmas where you're not sure a decision is the right decision. There's not one right path in a project where you're working with activists and you're working with social justice issues, you know, any of these things. It's hard.
What are we worrying about now?
Ethical decisions.
Why?
I don't know. Is that not, should I not worry about those?
No, of course you should. It's just that there can't be a miasma of guilt and fear over everything. No, I'm totally.
But Martha, I'm so good at guilt and fear.
Can you not even do it?
Okay, so, all right. Okay, so then maybe it wasn't an
So
ethical decision.
this, I have to talk about this, because I did have one rule, which is no pictures of people lying on the street. But, you know, so this was a project, okay, the one just disappeared, my pal Robbie Canal did with his students. So it was a picture of a person, it was a picture of a project based on a person lying on the street that was meant to say that a bus bench is the only housing project for the homeless in LA. And I thought, okay. But the idea was I did not want images of abjection as appeals for pity and charity, which are two things that I really consider the worst way you can appeal to somebody as part of a human species, is on the basis of pity and charity. And yeah. And that.
Do we need to talk about that?
Why?
So in 1989, you're already talking about the problems of Donald Trump. His,
he was a problem.
Developing empire.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about how you looked at it then and how you feel about it now?
But that's not my painting. However, I did say, it's by Andrew Castrucci, that of all the works in the show, the one I lusted to own was that painting of Donald Trump.
And it's about this big?
It's pretty big, and it was green. It's like he'd been drowned. Well, everybody knew that he was a creep and, a dishonest SOB. I'm working on a project on South Africa right now, based on footage I shot there in 1990. And I opened up a box of material I had saved, and there was a picture of wife number 2 on the Marla Maples when she was just his girlfriend. At the top of the box was this full tabloid from South Africa. Yeah, so he was a pop culture phenomenon for a long time. And everybody knew that he was a sleazy braggart and that his buildings were totally vile and so on. So enough about him.
Yeah, okay. So we just passed the beds.
Oh, yeah, and then there was...
We talked about these beds, did she?
Oh, did we pass the beds?
Yeah, we passed the beds.
Oh, okay, well, we can talk about them.
So I think a lot of times when you are working with activist groups, I try to find out what they need or what they want, like how can I be in service of them, and then I'm really clear with them what I'm kind of asking for. That's in there twice, right? Yeah. What I'm asking for from them as well. So one of the things that I read that Homeward Bound was really interested in was 6 beds that would be in the Dia Foundation show, right?
I should ask Dan whose idea this was.
The beds?
Yeah.
Because ultimately the Dia decided they couldn't do
Right.
it for...
Well, first of all, that's a condo, right? That first floor space? And...
Which space?
Oh,
77 Worcester?
A co-op, okay. So there are all the other artists in the building who own, and whoever else, had a fit about the show to begin with, especially because we chalked slogans on the sidewalk, and Dia was feeling very protective. And they said, the fire marshal will not allow anyone to sleep here, in case you were thinking of it. And I thought about it, and I thought that actually was probably true, that it's not a residential space. Of course, AAR was existing everywhere in New York, but you don't tell the people whose show, are giving you a show, you don't have a tantrum and say, I'm going to have people sleeping here. So we talked to Homeward Bound, and they actually were sleeping. They had a regular place in the basement of a church. And they said, okay.
It still functioned for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There was a picture of them holding a meeting. It's funny, the space looks really different depending on the type of lens you're using. It looks really compressed, but actually wasn't. Yeah. I mean, these are resilient people, and they didn't need us to have a place to sleep. They wanted the office. That was the issue.
Which,
So
that's
this
great.
is one of the casitas years later in the New York Times. It's still there. This is one in the, not our casita. Oh, I should tell you about the casita project, which was organized by Betty Sue Hertz at the Bronx Museum. She was in the third show with it. There were all these little houses, casita, or caseta in most of Latin America, little houses. We've seen this already too, just a few repeats. And the city felt that it was unsightly to have all these little houses that those Latinos were congregating in, so they were going to tear them down. And a group of scholars and folklorists and anthropologists said, we'll turn it into an object of study, and then they won't be able to tear it down, and it worked. So there was a project with photographer Martha, that's it, that's my piece.
That's the one that
Yeah.
was
Secret,
in the show.
yes,
Secretly in the
yes,
show.
secretly I had a piece in the show, which was this.
One of your photo montages.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk at all? There
were
like
30 videos,
films.
yeah.
Do you want to talk about what they were and how they function?
Well, they were about questions of housing, homelessness, entitlement, displacement, and so on from wherever we could get them from. They were not New York-based, though there were Shelter Force, Tammy Gold had something, some of them were in Spanish, Techos y Derechos, about roofs and rights, and how to fight back. Others were more artistic or performance-based, all different kinds, and actual films like Survival of a Small City. That anything that had an angle on questions of housing and especially housing under the pressure of displacement and so on. We had videos, and they were playing continuously. The films, some of them were rented, so they were screened, and that's why we had a free film flyer. And that was something else that Dia did that was very valuable. They postered the whole area and other parts of the city with the town hall meeting announcements and the shows and the films.
Didn't some of those announcements not acknowledge that Dia was an art space? It just had the address listed?
Well, it wasn't so much that. It was when the press called about the Madhousers, it didn't seem to make any sense to say they're here for an art exhibit. That was completely irrelevant, so we didn't say anything about that. They were in the paper, and I think there was a picture of some of the articles in The Voice and also in New York Newsday.
So, okay, so this project has continued.
Not
this exact project.
No, that's not what I was going to say. Not through any fault of my own. So I was teaching full-time in New Jersey at a state school. And Dia said they would have the shows photographed. That's fine. I took a few relatively lousy photo slides and so on, because it never occurred to me that anyone would want to know about this or want to see images of it, so whatever. And I've been talking about this recently because I think it's partly about the way the art world functions these days. Everything is in the eternal present. So this show is constantly being, not only do people, well, the first thing that happened was I was invited to England to a curatorial conference to talk about this show, which made no sense to me. First of all, I'm just an amateur. Secondly, what's interesting about this, since then I realized that curators have felt energized by this project, and in fact, a rather odious term has been developed to talk about the change in institutional address to issues that formerly were not acceptable, which is called new institutionalism, which is, kind of an obnoxious term, but it's also, there's this field of sociology called new institutionalism, so it's like they don't know what they're talking about. But anyway, so then people asked if I could show pictures, so then I had to make Xeroxes of my slides and then send them places and come and give talks. And I have to say I was invited to the Museum of Modern Art in Oxford to talk about the project in something about artists' projects. And in the middle of my giving a slide talk, the director, who I actually now know and will not name, stopped me and said, "This isn't your work, please sit down." And a bunch of people had come up from London to see.
When was this? What's the date?
I don't know. Like 90-something, obviously. Okay. Yeah. I love it. Times have changed, but perhaps not so much. But let's remember that Dia, with all its nose-holding, mounted the project and stood by the project, which is not a small thing, yes, and did a book.
So, you're working with really local issues.
Well, is that so?
Local groups?
Yeah.
I would think
Local
that it would
groups.
be judged by some in the.
This is Dia's real estate holdings at the time, which Charlie Wright said, "Martha, we really prefer it if you don't put this in the book." But Charlie, what's the... Well, it's just, let's not put this in the book. So it's not in the book, but it was on the wall.
Your slide present. Oh, it was on the wall.
Yeah, it was on the wall. Okay, so then, yes, I assume this is going to continue unless it's dead.
So it's not, I would say that it's
Hey,
well,
what's-
it's frowned upon.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and
Can we talk about your, okay, go ahead, yeah. I'm sure.
you can talk. I don't...
No, I'm really curious about like this issue of I feel like the work is really about local groups, local organizations. It has well, of course you brought in groups from other places.
Not a lot, but yeah.
But like right now you're doing a project on Greenpoint where you live, correct? Or you're collecting information? Didn't you tell me last night you were doing that?
I've been doing projects about Greenpoint since '92.
Since 92.
They're either video, they're authored. They're either video or photographs of people I know and so on.
And
They're not ambitious.
do you agree with me that, let's say, the kind of mainstream art world or art criticism often looks down upon working with these types of issues versus more what they consider universal
So
issues?
there were no reviews of this show when it happened, except in Europe. And then there were a few reviews, and an editor of one of the local one of the big three art magazines of the time said, "Martha, I can't get anybody to write about this show." And I said, "Whatever." And then I just did an iteration of it in the heart of Chelsea, which got no reviews.
Got one or two.
Oh, maybe online.
Yeah, online.
And the Times announced it, but it didn't review it.
So
I kind of think that's great.
why do you think that silence occurred? Or the lack of
I would say, well, I didn't expect it. So a woman, I was walking down the street in Soho about 2 years after this, and a woman, a nicely dressed woman, walked up to me and said, "Are you Martha Rosler?" I said, and she said, "You did that show about homelessness." And I said, "Yeah." She said, "Thank you so much." And then she walked off. It's one of those things that it's not nice. It's not nice to talk about, entitlement and stuff like that. It's just not nice.
What do you mean it's not nice? What do you mean by that? You mean it's not nice for some people?
It's not nice for the art world to dirty itself with questions of instrumentality and activism. It's one thing, I actually heard this from museum director friends. You can talk about it, you can symbolically do it, but once you are hosting groups that step outside the building and start doing anything in the neighborhood, you will lose your job. So
the silence.
a very interesting thing was the Agitprop exhibition, which was at the Brooklyn Museum this past year. And it was about successive waves of activism of artists, very nicely conceived show because artists invited artists. Unfortunately, the Brooklyn Museum had contracted its space, I bet everyone here knows this, to a real estate and gentrification central conference, and of course all the local activists, because I have to say there are many, many more and more visible activist groups now than there were then. I'm wearing the button of the Crown Heights tenants. And they buttonholed the museum, and especially the Agitprop, and said, "Hey, do something about this." And we won an exhibition wall in the museum and also a conference that was held a couple of months back. So here I am invited to do a project to bring the project to St. Louis. I said, no, it has to be about St. Louis. So here's what you're talking about. But I also brought
What
work.
was that project called?
Green Acres.
In the St. Louis project?
No, mine was called If You Lived Here.
If you lived here too? Or,
No,
okay.
that was the archive show.
Okay, that was the archive show. And was that like a year-long project? Oh no, that was Seattle, sorry. So can you talk about all the sites? This thing has, amazing.
It'll show up at the end.
Okay.
On the wall. So at a certain point, the art world became fascinated with the idea of the archive for many reasons. Oh, I wanted to say something about recurrence. You don't get to ever do something once. Everything has to be repeated. So I did a garage sale in 73 and then 77, and then when I had a retrospective, it went to 5 or 6 places, mostly in Europe, and at each place, the first curator didn't want a garage sale, fine, and then everyone wanted one, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger till it filled up half the basement at the new museum. And now I had to do one at MoMA in the atrium in 2012. This is a project from 73. This is a project from 89. I had a traveling library. People still want the traveling library. It's like I have, a catalog of, well, I have a library. How about that? I have a cooking show. How about that? I have, all this stuff that, no, I don't want to do it again. But, when you're dealing with questions of housing and gentrification, it's really difficult to say to people, that's a great idea. You should do that. And then they sort of shrink away and feel like I've rejected them. No, we really need to see. And this is where the archive is actually in play. They want the archive on display while they do work about their local community. And this is interesting. There's a historical continuity to these questions that are different from, it's not longitudinal to talk about garage sales. It's something entirely different. But to talk about housing questions, you really do need to see a history of struggle. You need to see a history of struggle because it gives people something to talk about and to build off. And what happened with the DIA shows was by having activist groups in the exhibitions and in the forums, they brought their local communities, so they built the audience, which is what we expected, but they also brought their city council members to say, see, we're on the wall here. So there was a kind of mutual recognition about their participation and the art world working with them, or however they chose to see it.
So we were talking earlier about participation, and I was saying that I'm not always optimistic, but one of the things I really believe in is that the exhibition space is actually a valuable site, that non-art world people tend to value the exhibition space and respect what artists do and want to be a part of that. Do you experience that same thing?
Activists are sometimes, especially housing activists, of course, are rightly wary about art spaces, because art spaces, like artists, are prime gentrifiers, right? We know this. They are blockbusters and neighborhood busters. So it's one thing, and also because there's a long history now of real estate people all around the world, really, offering empty storefronts to arts groups to make them visible and to have pop-up shows as another, everything's become codified and institutionalized. So, and now everybody understands the steps by which artists are invited in. They're the shock troops and so on, and then they're kicked out by their patrons, essentially. Chinatown is now very upset. Harlem is very upset by the fact that these are seen as sort of virgin territory for people to get cheap spaces. And of course, we actually knew this. There was something about that in terms of Atlantic Yards in the '89 show, but now it's visible to everybody. Right, so yes. They invited me to do a show, but when the guy heard me talk about it.
The Museum of Modern Art?
In Oxford, yeah.
In Oxford.
Yeah.
After they heard you speak?
Well, no, I was invited by the curator to do something about local and my project, but then when I gave the talk, the director shut me down because I didn't make any work, which sort of wasn't actually true, but that's okay. I'm just talking about the various ways that institutions relate to certain types of projects and the way that communities, so we also did street postering. They were very happy to do that.
It looks like the exhibition happened. How did he shut you down?
He shut down my talk. There was a conference associated with it.
I don't even understand that.
Yeah, but there was a let her speak moment, so I did finish the talk. I'm just explaining that institutions have various attraction and repulsion, including the Brooklyn Museum and its relationship to Agitprop. They were generous, but they also were annoyed at the activists, and the activists were annoyed at them. There's always tension, there's always more demands, there's always acting crazy to make a point, acting rejectionist to make a point, or whatever. So these are the Xeroxes that used to go around. And these are this is traveling with the retrospective and how the various curators were interested in representing the show. And then when the art world fell in love with archives, Anton de Dogley at Eflux and Maria Lind from Bard said, hey, we ought to have a show of If You Lived to Your Archive. And I said, boxes of documents? You want to show boxes of documents? Yes. What a bore. So we had a nice show. And then I remembered that I had all those photos. Oh yeah, this was like the zombie show. I couldn't go there. They made an amazing simulacrum of the show that it was like a mausoleum. No life. they did their best. What can I say? I didn't want to be in the show, but the curator said, I have 6 months to put together a show. You have to be in it. Anyway,
So, besides this Taipei Biennial, when it's not just an exhibition of the archive,
I am one of these crazy people that wants to see images, so I remembered I had all those Xeroxes and flyers and posters, and so we didn't expect the documents show, the archive show, which I called If You Lived Here Still, and it was, I think, 2009. It was invited to be shown in a couple of places in Europe, and I said, oh, but I think in my storage space I have all these pictures, so then you'll see them, it'll show up eventually. Onward. Yes, this is creepy. I think it's the floor.
well, maybe it's the camera
It's like
angle, because once again, it
2001.
seems monumental,
Yeah.
where the
It wasn't-
original show.
My department wouldn't let me go to, And this was a project in Rennes, and I said, no, you can't have the project. And they said, wait, you don't understand. We have a housing project in Rennes. It was a master class, master of curatorial. And the students want to use it to make a project about Rennes, so they did, which was their building. I said, well, in that case, it's serving its function.
Do you feel like when, say, a project like this happens where you have other people, other activist groups, other students, other people engaging in your project, do you feel a need to oversee that in any way? Do you worry about what groups are brought in along with your project?
I always say this can't just, when it's just the documents show, that's one thing, but every place the documents went had local participation. The same with the library. I'm not just having my books flying around. There has to be some local component where, it's not just people coming in and looking at books. So yes, there has to be something local, and I usually, of course I want to know what it is, but I usually trust the organizers to work with people who are I don't even know what to say. Yes, of course I trust them to know who their local contact should be. This is the document show. So it was based on, of course,
Is this the E-Flux show?
yeah, that was at 3 different places, but this is going to show. So the E-Flux gallery at the time was like a little hallway. So I was complaining these were moving too fast before, and now they're moving too slow. So this is part of all of these things on the wall were about Chinatown at that moment. There they are. Like what?
But, I mean, your goal has never been aesthetics. So it's almost like you're critiquing the way it looks or something, as if that's not...
I'm critiquing the idea that someone would want to come to a show that's a bunch of documents in 2009, that a bunch of documents about a show in 1989. I mean, really? And there they are. I just don't get it, I have to say. But, Anton said, Martha, don't be stupid. We'll have these tables, like the workers' tables, Mayakovsky, and we put documents under glass and so on. And it went to Costco in Utrecht and to La Verena in Barcelona. And there were symposia with each of them. And a reading room and the videos, and eventually, yeah. And local material and also imported material. There was someone doing a residency from Brazil, and she brought a number of Brazilian items, and we made it pretty.
So we have talked for like 55 minutes, or
Seems like a year.
I feel like a
We've been
year. Are you
talking for a
dying?
year. No.
So is there anything else that we haven't covered or you want to say about the project, or should we open it up to questions? Are you willing to take questions?
I just want to know if you have any more issues, because I think I've been really dominating the conversation.
You know, the fact is we've been talking about this, and you covered a lot of the issues. Like, you're amazing, Martha. This project is...
Certainly can talk, even if my throat is not good.
No, I mean, it's amazing to hear this project talked about, because I also still think it hasn't been written about enough.
Well, that I'm not too sure about, but also, why does it need to be written about?
Because I think it presents alternative models. I think modernism still dominates the art world. And I think that this offers...
Weren't you at our panel where Fred said, I'm a modernist?
No, I wasn't, because I had to go
that's
back
right.
to, fly here. I don't know how we both ended up in San Diego, and actually I was in Tijuana working on another project. But what did he say?
He said, well, first of all, we
Fred
both had
wanted
to
it,
point
right?
out that we are not in the anti-aesthetic group, no matter what people think. We are not de-skilled photographers, really important. We're not in the Dan Graham camp. God bless Dan. Well, seriously. But
What is the Dan Graham camp?
people who think that photography exists simply to show you something and they're not remotely interested. I mean, it's another form of document, and it's not tied into the traditions of documentary photography or anything of the kind. So this was in Reina Sofia last year.
I also
This
think
is Seattle.
that- I
This
also-
was the Seattle project. So the Seattle project was very ambitious. It was supposed to be a year of programming called Housing is a Human Right, and the curator, Yoko Ott, had wanted to have the 3 separate DIA shows separately presented, and we got through show number 1.5, and the person whose space it was said, that's it, goodbye, and closed her foundation and shut everything down. And and fired everybody. And then my wonderful gallery, Mitchell, Innocent Ash, said, why don't we just move the 3rd part here? Well, great. But how do you have a show about housing homelessness in the built environment in 2016 that's about Seattle? No. So together with Miguel Robles Duran, Dan Wiley, who was one of the original people, Marty Kirshner, who's in the audience, and
Just recently.
yeah, we had a whole new show based on the old show, but new show as well. And this is it. And we said, it can't be in a commercial gallery. So it was the Temporary Office of Urban Disturbances, not Mitchell, Innocent Nash. And we had to have a forum called Art Estate. And there's old and new material in here, and there's just about maybe 8 or 10 more slides. It'll show you where everything was, and then we can stop.
We got through the whole PowerPoint.
Unbelievable.
What about...
But without a list of the artists, there were 50 artists in this, and groups and so on. I'm sorry, I can't find my slide. That's LaToya Ruby Fraser, and you can see some of the old work. And I spent the last 1.5 years recollecting all the old videos and getting permission.
To use them again?
Yes, and to try to arrange fees for people. Seattle paid the fees.
For the screenings?
And invited new videos as well.
What about, can we talk a little bit about the critique of efficacy?
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Because,
This is a good one.
So it seems like artists who work with, well, I think all art is political, but they call certain ones of us political artists, and we're held to a different standard of that work is only good if we prove efficacy. And it seems in their minds, and in some of I mean, I think one or two of the reviews I read, they actually thought that your show should stop gentrification in New York and end homelessness in New York City.
See my halo? The Mother Teresa of anti-gentrification.
And if you don't do that, if you don't single-handedly change gentrification in New York and find homes for every homeless person, that your piece fails.
Well, yeah, but this is totally predictable, right?
Yeah.
You want to mess with things? You better get everything done. Everything you mention, every problem you bring up, you better solve it, or why are you wasting my time talking about it?
It's an underlying critique to try to stop,
Yeah.
I think, us from making
Don't
this
bother
kind of
me
work.
with that shit, because it doesn't work, and I don't care.
I don't want to be thinking about these ideas.
That's
Don't
right.
make me think about these
Right.
ideas.
Right.
It's your work. I don't know how many times people tell me, your work is supposed to make me happy. Yeah.
What?
They say, I want to be happy.
This is the LA problem.
No, these were New Yorkers. These were New Yorkers. I wanted to make me think nice things. I wanted to be happy.
So this is,
These are all the
yes,
This is
I can't believe it
crazy,
myself.
Martha.
It makes me nuts.
How do you do anything else?
Actually, the real question is, what with email and all, how do I do anything else? It has nothing to do with this. It's what is the life of the artist. Look, we're starting again so we can...
Okay. So, should we take questions?
Yeah, that means the light has to come on. Look, a hand.
We're going to turn on some lights, but I can be the woman to walk around with the microphone. So if you have a question, raise your hand. Yeah, there we go.
I hope I can structure the question well. English is not my first language, but you talk about how talking symbolically about this kind of stuff, it's just like, it's not enough, and I think it's not enough. But then you draw a line with, like, the example of the guy sleeping, because that is, it would just be like pity and stuff like that, which I also agree. But then, like, where do you stand between, like, symbolically and things that are, like, too much in your face in order to make it successful? And I don't mean the efficacy thing. I mean, like, in order to get a space in the art world, or for people from middle class and high class to see it, because low class people are not, they can see these things, but they're living it. They shouldn't be thinking about it. Like, the people that need to be, like, thinking about it is the people who are causing it, right? So how do you, like, position yourself? How do you get, like, how you, yeah.
I'm just trying to think what's the best way to talk about stuff like this.
Can I just say though, I don't think what class you come from affects how you can appreciate artwork, and nor does it affect your kind of intellect in any way. And I think that these works are also about organizing, like educating and organizing and mobilizing people.
No, I'm saying, like, how do you get them to the people that are, like, higher class and who are, like, mainly causing the problem? Because if I'm, like, doing, like, a work that is, like, for, I don't know, if I'm doing a work that it's about the narcos killing the woman in Tijuana, like, the people in Tijuana are gonna see it and they're like, yeah, we know about this. Like, we know it's happening. So how do you get them to, how do you position yourself so your work can be seen by people who don't know about it?
Well, that's assuming that the agency lies with the people who don't know about it, which you're presuming are people of a higher social class, but I would say something very different, which is that the whole point of organizing is to create a catalyst or an incubator in which people recognize they have the power. What it's Black Lives Matter about, it's not about black people who didn't know that Black Lives Matter, or people outside it who said, oh, you know what, Black Lives Matter, it's about self-organization and self-energizing. So there's a way in which you concentrate attention and energy and hope to create spaces in which people can think together about joining with your neighbors and other people. It's not about a class appeal. It's about appealing. That's why the show was called If You Lived Here. Who's you? You is the person being interpolated, is the person reading this. Because you do live here.
One of the downfalls of socially engaged practice is this notion of charity. And I think it's always
Actually,
better.
that's what Suzanne and I were always arguing about.
I mean, I'm arguing about this all the time because it's actually better to work with people that you have commonalities with. And you work together. So I'm always working with activists who I agree with their issues, right? And through that, we can start to speak out and organize and cause change in some way.
I would always say, Suzanne, I'm not a social worker. And she'd say, I am a social worker. But she meant something.
She wants something really
worker in the social. Yeah. It's not my job to tell people how to organize, but to point them at what there is to organize about, which they already know. I do want to say that what I think fools a lot of people about my work is that it's pretty much always about what you already know, including the anti-war montages. It's not as though we didn't know there was a war going on. You know this. It's a way of framing things so that it allows the viewer a different entry. And I would say the same about these shows. They become spaces in which people can think together or see other people thinking about or having thought. It's about forming a certain kind of active consensus. It's not about saying, do this and you'll be rich. Do this and you will have a home. It's about the fact that struggles take a long time and that what you need is to remind people of their agency, and not by saying you have agency, but by exhibiting agency that other people have displayed or are displaying.
I think a key issue is looking for groups that you have commonalities with, individuals or groups that you have common belief systems with. And you can simply start in a dialogical process, too, of asking questions. Instead of making statements, asking questions to yourself and to each other. And, I think that's the kind of strategy that I try to use when I start to work with an activist group. Just to see how we can be in service of each other and what we might do on a really small scale. Also, stop thinking about changing the world. Like I just think about my work, my art practice. Well, I do, but not individually. I think about it as a group process. Yeah. I think that there are so many of us out there who have these common beliefs and are trying in different ways to do little bits of change or movement instead of overthrowing a whole system. I'd love to do that, but probably not. But I'm thankful for making small moves because I know there's a whole bunch of other people out there working on similar issues. Sorry. I'm doing teaching now. Sorry.
Anybody else? I also wanted to know too. Could you just briefly tell us how you met each other?
I don't know. We started having lunches and dinners at Nancy Buchanan's together, right?
Right.
Nancy Buchanan, who's an amazing feminist
network that we're both part of in different generations.
When was that? How long has this been?
Years.
Yeah, it's been
years.
A while. So, LA is full of feminist and activist women, partly because they're out of the spotlight of the institutionalized art world that demands that that the art world is made up of a war of all against all. Because in fact, any real artist knows that art is made communally. And one of the problems with New York is that we're urged to forget that. So the best thing about LA is the commonality of concern and sociality and so on. So,
Up
I don't
until
know.
recently, because I feel like New York gentrification is moving part of the New York art world to LA, which is closing in, and it scares me because LA has always been a center for academic institutions. And so, I was taught by a group of amazing artists, and then I get to teach a group of younger amazing artists. So there's not a culture, there's not a market competition. We actually it's familial, and we get together and we talk about ideas and we support each other because it's generations.
And in fact, for the Agitprop show, I chose Nancy Buchanan for the next generation, and Nancy chose you.
Chose me.
This year. And then we had a conversation on stage together.
And in a really personal way too. There was a time in my life where I was going through a lot of personal issues, and I had already been like stalking a bunch of these feminist artists from Martha's generation because I really wanted to meet them and know them and talk to them and learn from them. And I became friends with some of them over time. And then as I went through personal problems, I realized that feminism wasn't just theoretical, that it was a lived experience, and this group of women like came around me and supported me. And I was like, okay, so this is what it really is. It's about getting through life and supporting each other and having each other's backs. So it makes me cry to think about it. But it's that lived experience is so different than reading books about it. And that's one of the crucial things of, I think, how I am an artist that I am, is because I'm trying to meet people like Martha and get to know them and experience their ideas and their philosophies.
I was just curious, I never asked that. Okay, we'll take maybe one more question. Anybody has anything?
Come on, you guys. Yeah.
Okay.
We have to talk less so they can get.
I know, right? Yeah.
I was wondering really quickly, you discussed the town halls and the one where the artists were talking about housing and for themselves, and then went forward for artists, and then went forward to talk about how art institutions are gentrification catalysts. And what do you make of that then? Because these artist housing systems would then cause further gentrification, would they not?
There was a town hall meeting about it. I wasn't advocating for it. I thought, or against it. I thought this was such an issue at the time that it really needed to be discussed in the art world, and this was the right opportunity. The first panel of the exhibition we just had was called Art Estate, as I said. I was forced to be on that panel by my co-organizers, but it was a panel about precisely this, about what it means for there to be an art world that takes up space and changes the nature of space. And of course, what we're talking about is raising land values, which changes the focus of a neighborhood. And the first thing that you saw when you walked into that exhibition was a map of all the art galleries in New York City that we could find on a particular, there's a site that you can look, and there were pins for each one. And of course, it was actually not anywhere near all of them, but so there's no answer to this. But I don't have any problem with artists trying to set up cooperative housing. It's when it becomes a blockbuster or highly subsidized, then you have to question, why is this being supported and who's supporting it? But I don't think that artists shouldn't have live-work spaces, for example. We need them, but...
I mean, I think there's also like intersectionality. Like I was thinking about Rick Lowe's project in Houston. So...
But he's selling those houses.
I don't know if he's selling them. He stepped down.
Yeah, and I think his final word on this is, well, this is
I don't know. I haven't.
gentrification of the area now. That's what I read. But it was an amazing project.
It was an amazing project for a really long time.
Okay, we'll take one more.
One more? Come on.
Unless there's
At least it's one.
focus on this area, but is there anybody over there that? Okay.
I think I first just want to acknowledge that reading your piece that you wrote, I think like 2 years ago when you spoke at Cooper, like Death of Bohemia, or like on...
Oh, yeah, Art Death Bohemia. That was
Yeah.
Coco Fusco and Noah Fisher's conference. They were both in the show I just did.
And I wanted to kind of talk like divergently about two things, but the disenfranchisement that I think universities in this like neoliberal time period perpetuate on students of art, but also to kind of question, because we're taught this tradition of like social practice, and we're taught that it has existed and that it is like a possibility. But I think there's a really glaring question of, is this like where my voice should be? Like, is this the question of authorship, I guess, and who should be saying, who should be giving these critiques, who should be representing these issues? I don't know, like, so how have you encountered that in the decades-long career that you've had, and how have you navigated that?
I never use the term social practice. Yeah, but it's important. I brought this book because it's a follow-up. It's called Culture Class, and these essays are available online. You can't hear me? No, I said I've read that. I see. They're available in eFlux Journal, talking about, in effect, the same issues, artist gentrification and Richard Florida's theory from 2002, of the creative class and the various slippages and lies.
What's your alternative?
Yeah.
What's your alternative, I guess, to, like, what are you thinking about? What would you do if you didn't approach the kind of political issues that you're attempting to approach? Would you make abstract painting?
No. Sometimes I'm like, do I just write a book? Like, should I just... Sometimes I'm like, should I just write a book or like an essay? Like, I don't know.
But
is the gallery space, not only is the gallery space the right place to exercise these concerns, but also like, should I be the one to talk about it, being a student in a like corporate university? But I mean, this is a different problem from like what you've faced for decades in a very different art world.
I'm hot-headed, so I don't worry about that stuff that much. And I really think, just decide what you want to do and do it, and, make sure you talk to somebody about it so you are not, seriously aggressing against something that you hadn't thought about. But, I have trouble with this idea. That's why one of the problems I have with the idea of social practice is, one, you get a lot of credits in the something or other world, the philanthropic world, for doing something that they can slot into social practice. But here's the point. I just want to make a point based on my own show. One of the problems with the show I had in Seattle was that it was a result of my having won a prize there for women whose work is engaged in social justice. But I think that the person whose space it was and who was so generous as to give me a bundle of cash had a problem. And I wrote about this a long time ago, about the difference between critique in general and critique. It's one thing to be in favor of social justice, but once it's your community and it's about where you live and the elites of this in your city, you might not actually be so happy. And all of a sudden the project ended. And it's the difference between symbolic activity and activity that actually you have a meeting at the library, which I did, in which I said, I'm not talking to artists, I want to talk to activists. Oh, but you have to talk about art. Yeah, but I want to talk with activists. There's a difference between saying, well, yeah, it's my art. Well, it is my art, but that's not the point. when things begin to encroach in the real world, it depends on who's giving you money and which group they think you're affecting and which group you're not affecting.
But in this case, like real estate continues to be attached to
Yes.
art collectors in the art market. It's like a direct connection.
What a surprise.
I mean, the most
So-
negativity I ever got and the most attacking I ever got was the Frieze Art Fair unionizing issue. That was internally in the art world the thing I've been attacked for. I sit at a dinner party sometimes and they're like, "Are you that one? Did you really do that?" And then they get up and they walk away.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so we are, to many rich people, we are the monkeys on the leash, and when we slip the collar, we're dangerous. Take their money by all means, but you really have to consider that you're going to get shut down unexpectedly, or you're going to sit across from the billionaire at dinner, as happened to me, who's going to tell you about what a monster Hillary is and how you have to vote for Trump and why and what nice kids he is. You funded the show, man. This is in, which is in another, on another coast. Yeah, yeah, this is, you know, you just have to figure it out. Every push has a counter push. The one thing about culture, because culture drives so much of social formation in this particular neoliberal era, you have to realize that you're going to get put into certain boxes, and if someone decides you've actually slipped the leash, as I was saying, you're going to get shut down. But if that determines what you do, you know, do something else. Don't use the art world as your platform. I'm actually interested in art. I'm extremely interested in art and issues of representation. But I don't think everybody has to be. If you want to be a social activist, fine. But social practice, I don't know. I just don't know.
I mean,
They can do it on the West Coast for the obvious reasons. It's the provinces.
I don't know if it can be academicized. I don't know. I think that it really has to exist in a place where the education is free and not $60,000. I think it should be in, either an alternative space or it should be in community colleges, which I hope, if Hillary's elected, becomes free. I don't know. I mean, I think that there's a real rub between how much college costs and trying to have a program like
I
that.
think what I was trying to say is, don't let the fears of offending or transgressing drive your project and shut it down. You need to figure out some way around it, but also it helps to work with other people because you can think together. And also nobody says you have to do one thing. I actually write occasionally, and so I think there needs to be a certain fluidity in your thinking. And if you wind up trying to think at too abstract a plane, you wind up shutting yourself down, just as we had a lot of problems with the idea that we were bringing a show about gentrification to Chelsea. So we just renamed the space. And also, in a way, the art world says, yeah, sure, that's fine. Whatever, that's totally cool. Whatever. So, I don't know. Anybody from here?
Any last words? Well, I just want to thank you both so much for sharing.